Okay, so this is a video that I'm doing for my Year 9 class on the causes of the First World War. But it's not just exclusively for that Year 9 class. Anyone can tune in and listen to it. But it's about the period of time that lasts from 1870 all the way through to 1914. So it's several decades. So we're going to go through this not just looking at each country individually, but we're going to look at themes. So we're going to look at secret treaties between nations that raise tensions. We're going to look at it through the rise of nationalism. We're going to look at what role empires had to play and what role arms races had to play, on why these countries in Europe were becoming more and more intensely suspicious, angry and jealous of one another in the run-up to 1914. So firstly, before we go any further, let's talk about the countries that we're actually going to discuss. We're going to look at Britain and the British Empire, the most powerful country in the world in 1914, with the largest empire. France, her closest neighbour and ally by 1914. We're going to look at Germany, the new and powerful empire in the centre of Europe, and her ally Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So those are four powers. The two remaining powers that we're going to discuss are Russia, the Russian Empire, which stretched from Poland all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and we're going to look at Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. So empires is a good place to start. Europe had been divided under the rule of six great powers for much of the 19th century. Prussia developed by 1871 into a new giant German empire following the defeat of France and the Franco-Prussian War and the crowning of the Kaiser at the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. And all these great European powers, along with smaller powers like Belgium and the Netherlands, believed that if a country was to be great in the 19th century, it couldn't simply have territory in Europe, it must have powerful overseas empires. Why did most countries have this idea? Well, most countries had this idea because they looked to the vastness of the British Empire as their example. They looked at the huge British Empire and saw it as an example to follow. They believed that the British had become wealthy and prestigious because of their overseas empire. And indeed, Britain had become wealthy and powerful because of this. It was partly this desire for overseas colonies that initiated a period between 1882 and the turn of the century called the Scramble for Africa, where the German, French, Belgian and Italian empires very quickly, along with the British, took large sections of African territory, colonising nearly the entire continent in the space of a couple of decades. And this scramble for Africa inevitably led to tensions between each of the empires rising, so much so that by 1898 the British and the French are close to going to war over the territory of Sudan. In another part of the world, tensions also rose as a result of the competing ambitions of two different empires. In the Balkans, the southeast region of Europe that stretches from the southern end of the Austrian Empire all the way down to Greece. And if you're not sure about where that might be, have a look on a map. Stop the recording now. Go have a look on a map and then come back. Okay, done that? Great. The Balkans was a region that was sandwiched really between the Austrian Empire in the west and the north and the Russian Empire to the east. South of the Balkans was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire that had come into Europe from Turkey during the Middle Ages, had once stretched almost as far as the gates of Vienna in Austria. But throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, it had begun to decline. The Ottoman Empire had found it was unable to compete with rival European powers, and so began to decline. And as it did, the Christian, Orthodox Christian nations that it had dominated, countries like Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece, and Albania, one by one had a series of nationalist uprisings, and the power that the Turks had once had to crush these and put them down violently were swiftly dissipated. Both Austria and Russia were very interested in gaining territory in the Balkans. Neither power wanted the other to become influential in that region. The reasons why are quite complicated. Firstly, Russia was a Slavic nation. That meant that the ethnic peoples of Russia were Slavs. The peoples of the Balkans, particularly countries like Serbia and Bulgaria, were also ethnically Slavic. This meant that they spoke the same language, had the same culture, and also they were worshippers of the Orthodox Church. The Tsar of Russia had traditionally always been the defender of Slavic peoples around the world, and he was certainly meant to be the defender of the Orthodox faith. It was a great insult to Russian national pride to see the Serbs and other Orthodox Christians ruled by the Islamic Ottomans. So they believed that it was their role to intervene in the Balkans when it was possible to protect the rights of other Slavic people. They had an ulterior motive, however. Russia had always wanted to be able to access the seas from a port that didn't freeze half the year round. The majority of Russia's ports could be found in the far reaches of the Arctic North, so places like St. Petersburg would freeze with thick sheets of ice for at least 6 months of the year, meaning that Russian warships found it very difficult to access the high seas. This meant that Russia would never become a naval power unless she was able to access a warm water port. These were all available in the Balkans if she could find a nation there that looked up to her, that wanted Russia as a friend. There were many potential candidates here. Austria also had an interest in the Balkans. The Austrian Empire, by the 1860s, the late 1860s, was known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a multi-ethnic empire. That meant that the actual Austrians in the Austrian Empire were in a minority. They were a nation that ruled over many different peoples, Poles, Croats, Czechs, Ruthenes, Slovenes, Slovaks, Dalmatians, Jews, and others. And they looked to the events of the Balkans as the Ottoman Empire declined with a great deal of worry. They saw that every time the Ottoman Empire was forced to retreat, the nations that it had managed and governed and controlled began to have nationalist uprisings. So they would elect nationalist governments, and the population would be very enthusiastic about nationalist ideas. And don't worry about what nationalism is, because we're going to move on to that in a moment. And the Austrians saw that their empire was really a kind of a patchwork of lots of small countries. And they believed that if nationalism was to spread to their empire, that it would fragment it, it would divide it up into lots and lots of small nations, and Austrian power would be gone forever. So, to control the Balkans, that would stop the spread of nationalism, and it would also give Austria new territories, new power, and new economic might. Austria had been defeated several times in the 19th century by France and Germany, and had been humiliated by the loss of control over Italy because of nationalism, and a loss of influence in Germany because of nationalism. Now she found that there was the possibility of losing control in the Balkans because of nationalism, and this was really something that could not be borne. This was something that was too unpleasant to consider. So both Austria and Russia had competing interests in the Balkans. Austria and Russia had been in a union, an alliance with Germany that began in 1874, called the Dreikaiserbund, or the League of Three Emperors. When disputes arose over the Balkans, 4 years later in 1878, the Germans had to decide which of their two allies they were going to back, and they decided to back the Austrians, as these were a German-speaking people and a nation who was closer in outlook to Germany. Germany had to abandon Russia, and this led to a great deal of resentment. The Chancellor of Germany, Otto Bismarck, had created the Dreikaiserbund, the League of Three Emperors, in order to prevent either Austria or Russia from becoming an ally of France. The reason for this was simple. The German Empire had been established in 1871 after the victorious war over France the previous year. The destruction of the French army had left the French extremely bitter and angry and demanding revenge. The French Empire had been replaced by the French Empire had been replaced by a French Republic, and the German Empire became the predominant power in Europe, taking France's limelight away from her. France was, as I've mentioned, bitter and angry, and Bismarck knew that France would try to secure an alliance with a nation to the east of Germany, so either Russia or Austria. If she did that, Germany might be forced one day to fight a war on two fronts, so fighting two enemies at the same time. And Bismarck suspected that this would be too much for Germany. Germany had been very successful, as a very powerful warlike nation, and had been very successful in defeating her enemies in the 1860s and 1870. But now Bismarck knew that there was probably a good chance that she wouldn't be successful again. So forming an alliance to freeze France out of European diplomacy was a good idea. However, when this alliance breaks down, France quickly seizes the opportunity, and by 1894 has an alliance with Russia. So here we've got evidence of how the growth of empires and imperial rivalries led directly to the rise in tensions. Russia's ambitions in the Balkans to expand into the Balkans had been thwarted because Germany had chosen to back Austria, and because of that, Russia became an ally of Germany's chief enemy, France, and it meant that now Germany was surrounded by two enemy powers. Now, let's see how Britain fits into this picture as well. Britain and Germany had traditionally enjoyed reasonably good relations. Britain throughout the 18th and 19th centuries had normally been at war with France. So you would expect if a war had broken out across Europe in 1914, that Britain would be allied to Germany, not France. But this isn't the case. The British, in the later part of the 19th century, come to see Germany as their biggest threat. Why? Well, after 1888, the Germans have a new Kaiser, or emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And Kaiser Wilhelm II was a very unpredictable man, very erratic, angry and jealous and unstable. He was a man who believed that Germany needed to have what he called a place in the sun. Germany needed to be glorious. He believed that Germany had a right to a vast colonial empire internationally, the likes of which Britain was able to have. And he also believed that Germany should have a navy that rivaled the Royal Navy. Much of this was he wanted for glory, for prestige, for power, and believed that Germany should be able to intervene in diplomatic disputes around the world, and that if things were to be resolved, if territories were to exchange hands between different empires, that Germany should be consulted, and Germany should have the final say. Why did he believe this? Well, he believed this because Germany was a new nation, Germany was a militarily powerful nation, and Germany was an economically powerful nation. So Germany was extremely influential in Europe, but the Kaiser wanted to ruffle the feathers of other European nations in a way that Bismarck had never dreamt of doing. Bismarck had believed that it was important probably for Germany not to have an empire and to stay out of disputes with other nations, because Germany had done well to establish her empire, but this could all be taken away from her. The Kaiser makes a number of diplomatic statements that anger Britain. He chooses to meddle in Britain's affairs in South Africa. In South Africa, the British were particularly keen on defeating the Dutch Boer farmers when it was discovered that gold and diamonds were found in the Transvaal region of South Africa. And the Kaiser chose to publicly back the Boers against Britain, and even suggest that he might get involved at some point if he thought that the Boers' rights were being threatened. So this was the kind of thing that was always going to make British public opinion extremely angry. And by 1904, the British had found a way to mend their disputes with France, and Britain's King Edward VII managed to broker a deal with France where both France and Britain would agree that to respect each other's territories in Africa and to respect each other's spheres of influence in Africa, so there could be no more dispute between them. And they both agreed that the main enemy was Germany. This agreement is not an alliance but an agreement, takes place in 1904 and is called the Entente Cordiale, or the friendly understanding, the friendly agreement. In 1908, Britain signs a similar agreement with Russia, the Anglo-Russian Entente. So this is why Britain, France and Russia during the war become known as the Entente powers, and the Germans and Austrians become very panicked and see themselves as having been surrounded by these three powers. The force of public opinion in all European countries is very powerful. If you imagine that throughout the 19th century, countries like Germany and Italy and France had developed into modern nation states, so they had become, in the case of Germany and Italy, physically unified, and in the case of France, a modern state that had a large population that was highly educated, that could read, and that had a modern printing press that could supply this new literate population. And this goes from most of Europe, with all sorts of printed ideas in newspapers every day. Well, many of these newspapers printed ideas about national greatness, national glory, patriotism, the wonders of empire, and the British in particular decide that they are very keen on their empire in a way that ordinary British people had never really expressed before. So this is called a period of popular imperialism, i.e. an imperialism of the people, an enthusiasm for imperialism shared by most of the people. Throughout Europe, then, you get large national populations of millions and millions of people who are very passionate about the affairs of their country, the prestige, the pride, the military strength, and the imperial territories that their country has. And they do not wish to see their country humiliated by foreign powers at all. And this means that when the crisis, the July crisis in 1914 comes, it makes it far more likely that things are going to get out of hand very quickly. It used to be that diplomacy and foreign policy was simply conducted by and decided by government ministers or aristocrats. In the 19th century, all of a sudden, the general population is involved in arguing for a particular kind of foreign policy, very aggressive and assertive foreign policy. One of the ways that public opinion became very involved in foreign policy and diplomacy in the later years of the 19th century was surrounding the issue of arms and of arms races. The most significant arms race was that between the German Empire and the British. In the last couple of years of the 1890s, the Kaiser of Germany and his naval minister Alfred Tirpitz decided that the German Navy would rival the Royal Navy. The German Navy would build in the next 20 years an equivalent number of battleships to threaten Britain's dominance in the North Sea. The Germans never really believed that they would be able to build as many ships as the British. The British had a fleet guarding territorial waters called the British Home Fleet, and it was this that the Germans thought that they would be able to threaten and challenge. The British reacted very badly to the idea that the British Home Fleet would be challenged, and a naval race began, which by 1906 had culminated with the British building of the Dreadnought series of battleships. There was a cry from the general public and the newspapers, and a popular chant that said, "We want 8 and we won't wait," by which it meant that the British public wanted 8 new Dreadnought battleships. These were the state-of-the-art fighting ships with new guns and armour that were easily the rival of any warship on the seas. The Germans tried to quickly match the Dreadnought building programme, and the more the Germans built, the more the British built in return. This was hugely costly to Britain, and Britain at the time in 1906 was also experiencing a period of social reform where new rights for workers, unemployment insurance and pensions were being introduced, and the cost is extremely high. The British have to bring in a radical new budget to pay for it. That's a story for another time. The British and German general populations both cheer on the arms race and see it as a matter of national prestige. And the British, one of the motivations for going to war in 1914, and one of Britain's war aims throughout the war, is to deprive Germany of her ability to threaten Britain's power on the high seas. There were similar arms races, though landlocked ones, between Germany, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But they perhaps had less of a significance in bringing about war. Though Germany looked to Russia, I beg your pardon, and believed that it was imperative, it was important that Germany prepare for war as quickly as possible against Russia, because they believed that once Russia had really fully organised herself properly and become an industrialised military nation, that combined with the size of Russia's population would make her really unbeatable. So all these factors come to a head in the summer of 1914. In June 1914, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife travelled to Sarajevo in Bosnia. Bosnia was a territory that had been claimed by Austria in 1878, but it was one that was disputed by Serbia, one of the countries who had been dominated by the Ottoman Empire and had emerged as a new nationalist power. The Serbians believed that they should have Bosnia, and they were fiercely independent and scornful and opposed to and antagonistic towards Austria. When the Archduke Franz Ferdinand travelled to Sarajevo, he ignored some good advice to not go and was the victim of 2 assassination attempts that day, the second of which worked, seeing him and his wife gunned down. In the days that followed, the Austrians consulted with Germany. Germany gave Austria a guarantee that Austria would be supported by Germany no matter what. It was referred to as the Kaiser's blank cheque. This really emboldened Austria and made them believe that they would be able to teach Serbia a lesson, even though Russia now guaranteed the security of Serbia, who were Slavic people, who had been and who the Russians believed they had a duty to protect. Austria invades Serbia when Serbia refused to give in to Austrian demands, which were quite unreasonable. And the Serbs are humiliated and defeated by the Austrians. And this results in Russia threatening war. The Tsar of Russia writes to the Kaiser of Germany and says, well, how would it be that Russia could just fight a war with Austria when we knew we could win? And then we wouldn't have to fight Germany, and Germany wouldn't have to fight us, and we could, because we have no quarrel with you, really. The Kaiser wrote back and said, out of the question. You make war on my ally, and you make war on me. And by the time the Kaiser's letters had arrived with the Tsar of Russia, Russia's armies were mobilised and moving, so the war had begun. So at this point, Germany declares war on Russia, and Russia is forced to advance on not just Austria, but Germany as well. The British are wondering what to do and whether to become involved, and they become involved on August the 4th, not before the German army advances into France, Russia's ally, and marches on Paris. And it is only timely intervention of the French army and the British Expeditionary Force that stop them. And this stalemate means that Germany can't win, but neither can the Allies. And both sides in France and Belgium become bogged down in a long line of fortifications from the Channel all the way through to the Alps. And these are the front lines of the trenches, in between which is no man's land.